I'm good. I'm glad we could establish a connection.
Yes, glad to talk. Am I saying that right? Timon, is that how you say it?
Timon, yeah, it's like Simon with a T.
All right.
Great.
Yes, sorry, it took me a while to be able to schedule it.
No, I know everything about it. Children is it's like a second job, right?
Yes.
So I'm glad we could meet. As I wrote to you, I'm a full-time teacher, and I'm always trying to find out what's best for educators in the field and what's best for my students. And this book came along, and I was really curious about its history and how things are going right now, and what the future looks like for your projects.
Okay.
But before we start, I was wondering, you were a teacher yourself once. So would you reflect back on that time and how it all started?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, so how it all started was first, I think so many teachers were deeply influential for me growing up. And so I think it was the profession that I was just naturally drawn to because I felt like I wanted to do what those teachers had done for me, for other people. So my first job out of university was teaching English at a private school in New Jersey for relatively wealthy families. And I think I was a pretty poor teacher. I think I was well-intentioned, but like so many teachers, I just didn't really know. Eric Callenzy makes this great point in his book, that Education is Upside Down, is that people don't even really agree on what the purpose of education is. And I don't think I was a very good teacher in that setting. I think I wanted the kids to like me a lot, and somehow I had confused that with effective teaching. And I thought if they were happy and if they liked me a lot, that I was doing well. And in retrospect, I think that I just didn't really know the first thing about it. So that was where I started teaching, at least. And then I decided I wanted to be a university professor and be a professor of English for some reason. Then I went to start a PhD program and realized very quickly that university work is not about teaching. So I left that and ended up starting a charter school with some colleagues in Boston, and and that's kind of where all the work that I do now began for me.
So today you're not teaching anymore. So how long has it been since you taught?
I've been in the classroom every day. Well, it's interesting because I maybe I'm not allowed to. I do think of myself as teaching still, and that I think one of the forms of teaching that we do worst is the teaching of adults. I think, we think a lot about what it takes to engage young people in learning, and then we sit adults down and talk to them about learning, and we put them in the most brutal professional development environments. So this may be a self-serving argument, but my colleagues and I, run 20 or 30 workshops a year where we think very intentionally about them as teaching venues. And then one of the best parts about it is that I get to teach them with a group of great teachers. So we're constantly sort of reflecting on our teaching. So hopefully I'm not totally detached from the profession, but it's been since I taught full-time. The last time I taught full-time would have been, let me think about this, it's probably been close to 20 years.
It's a while ago. Well, you just mentioned you're still teaching to teachers, right? You're almost like a teacher educator. And I know from experience that teachers are a really tough crowd because normally you have 1, 2, 3, 4 students who think they know better, but every teacher thinks they know better than you do. I mean,
yes,
no exception.
And many of them probably do.
So let's go to American education. I've interviewed many professors from the United States, Diane Ravitch, Michael Fullen, Andy Hargreaves, and we've talked about education a lot of times. And I always ask the question, how do you look at American education today? If you look at education today, what do you see?
I see a lot of confusion. One thing that I think about your work is that I think there's a general slowness to embrace what's. I mean, I think we've learned more about how people learn how the brain works in the last 15 years than we did in the previous 300 years. And I'm always stunned by how slow and resistant much of the education sector is to cognitive science, what research tells us about how people learn. Sometimes it supports the things that people did when they based their practices on ideology, but sometimes it conflicts with them. And I think people are very, very, very slow to change and very judgmental about and ideological about making those changes, which I think is hugely challenging. And then I think it's I think some of the, it's drastically unequal. I think the importance of education, the returns to education, has increased exponentially. There used to be middle class, safe middle class jobs that you could do if you weren't you weren't educated to do thinking work, and those jobs are disappearing. And there's a bigger and bigger divide between the people who do thought work and the people who don't. And our education system has become increasingly less and less equal, and less meritocratic. And I find that alarms me.
How does it show?
Time I feel some optimism because I see the people who are teaching, and they're incredible people, and they always have been. They're great problem solvers, and so I guess I feel a combination of optimism about the people who are involved in the profession and concern about, or pessimism about, the larger context.
How are there any easy fixes for the problem? Sometimes the solution is easier than you think. Are there any easy fixes?
Yeah. The two statements you just made are different statements. One is sometimes the solution is easier than you think. And I really believe that that's true, that one of the most influential books for me is Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. And they say this, we always assume that the size of the solution has to match the size of the problem, but there's tons and tons of examples and where small changes cascade throughout a situation to make tremendous change. So I truly believe that you're right, that oftentimes simple changes can have dramatic results. I think that's especially true in the classroom. I don't know that I would describe it as easy, though, to do that, even implementing small changes. At least in the American education landscape, I think it's just very difficult. It's difficult to get people to change the way they do things. It's difficult to implement anything across a system that has developed itself to be resistant to coordinated change. So I think my point is that executing even simple ideas in a complex environment is not always simple. But I think it can be done. And I think some of the most powerful ideas are ideas about ideas about the classroom. One of the great things about it, if you're a tiny bit more efficient and a tiny bit more effective in each of 100 interactions over the course of a day, over 180 school days or 190 school days over the course of the year, you only need to be a little bit better in those interactions to make a tremendous difference in the lives of a lot of students. So I think that's why I do the work that I do, is that I feel like small changes to the craft of teaching ultimately can have profound effects. That's probably what I should have said at the beginning. I haven't had coffee yet.
Last month I talked to Professor Eric Hanushek. You might know his work. And
yes,
what he proposes is get rid of the bottom 5% of bad teachers. Get rid of bad teachers. Well, there's one problem. How do you assess whether a teacher is better or good? It's one of the most asked questions, I suppose, when people ask you questions. So what do you think of that solution, getting rid of the 5% worst teachers?
I think it's probably... look, teaching is an incredibly hard profession. It's an incredibly hard profession to do. So it would be foolish of us to think that everyone could do it equally and that there weren't people who shouldn't really be doing it in the profession. So I think that they're there, and I agree with him that it would be wise to coach out of the profession people who are clearly not capable of doing it well. And especially because those people are most likely to work with the students of the greatest need and the least opportunity. So it also has, in addition to having a generally negative effect on education outcomes, it has a particularly negative effect on underprivileged students. So I think it makes sense. It would be hard to measure. It would be confrontational, but I think it can be done. I think I actually don't think it's a real secret in most schools who the people. If we're talking about the bottom 5%, we're not talking about particularly sophisticated data algorithms, right? We're talking about people who everyone in the building pretty much knows are either struggling mightily or aren't doing their job. If we're talking about the bottom 30%, you have a complex data question. If you're talking about the bottom 5%, it's probably an open secret who those people are. I think data should. I think my general thinking about testing data is that data should inform decisions, but not make decisions. That data can't be an algorithm. You can't look at a series of test scores and say, this is the weakest teacher and this is the best teacher. But that organizations, schools that are accountable for results, data should be one of their management tools. So if I wanted to make smart decisions about who to hire and who to promote and who to develop and who's in trouble and needs intensive support, I would want to combine objective data with the subjective data that a good principal has over his or her schools, and I'd want to give the data to the principal and hold the principal accountable for school results, and assume that he or she would make the right decisions by combining sort of observational data with objective data. And I feel pretty confident that in most cases, if you have a competent principal, they would be able to spot the bottom 5% pretty quickly.
In your presentations, you show lots of charts, lots of data. I wrote you the question, is Teach Like a Champion, is it science?
No. I love science, and I think science is really important, but my book is not science, and I don't purport it to be. I think it's data informed and research informed. It's a translation of some scientifically backed principles. I think it's not coincidental that a lot of things that cognitive science says we should be doing in the classroom are the things that I found top teachers doing when I studied them. But I would not describe my book as science.
Because today most teachers or teacher leaders talk about the term evidence-based or evidence-informed. And yesterday I talked to a professor who said, well, it's impossible to have evidence-based education. You would be needing 2 test groups or 3 randomized samples. If you really want true science, it doesn't happen in education.
Yeah, you can't do the gold standard, a gold standard assessment in education. Because people ask us all the time, but have you tested this with a double blind? And it's all but impossible. And to do it, you would have to decide that was all that you wanted to do. I actually write about this in the introduction to Teach Like a Champion, about how I also think that even if there's an idea that is right, a scientifically proven idea, how you implement that idea in front of 30 14-year-olds at 10 o'clock in the morning, the day after Halloween, that's a very how you combine that idea, even if that idea is right. Is it the only right idea about teaching? No, there are lots of other proven ideas about and speculative ideas about teaching. And so the challenge of teaching is taking ideas that are supported by study and science and research and figuring out how to implement them effectively in the reality of the classroom in combination with all the other things that we want to accomplish. And I just don't think there will ever be simple research-driven answer to that. It's always going to be a series of strategic problem-solving based adaptations by teachers, which doesn't mean that understanding the research and understanding the science are not really important, but I don't think they'll ever tell us formula, solution.
No, there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah, right. And the right answer is different for you and me and some other. Right, you teach music and I teach English, and so those have different solutions. And they have a different solution for you on Tuesday morning than on Wednesday morning. Sometimes they have a different solution for you with your 3rd period class than with your 6th period class. They have different solutions for different people. So I think that it will never be a simple answer.
And yet, when you look at John Hattie, Visible Learning, he's considered a scientist. When you look at Robert Marzano, I interviewed him as well 2 years ago. He's considered a scientist. And his books are used in universities. And in one of your presentations, one of your colleagues mentioned that your book is used in is present on 7 book lists out of 250. She did some research, and I'm sure that Marzano's book is present in a lot more universities. So
Definitely.
there is a distinction. And what is the distinction between, let's say, Marzano's The Art and Science of Teaching and your Teach Like a Champion?
Mm-hmm. Is your question really why don't more universities universities more interested in Marzano than in Teach Like a Champion?
I'm asking this because we've just established that it's impossible to work from an evidence-based approach, and yet we only allow official scientific literature in teacher education. So who are we fooling? That's why I'm asking the question. Why is that difference between where's the difference between your book and Marzano's book or John Hattie's book?
First of all, I think those are very good books, and Marzano and Hattie have been around for a lot longer than me, and I respect them immensely. And so, especially I think Hattie in particular is uses the science really well. And so for the most part, if they're using Hattie's book, I'm happy. It's a good thing. I hope over time people will come to see my book equally. I do think you're right that my book tends to be read more by frontline practitioners. Teachers and school leaders themselves read it more than students of education, though I think that's changing. I think there are good and bad reasons for it. One of the reasons it makes me sad, one of the things I tried to do in my book was, I think that teachers get told a lot what they should do. And if you look at professions that have a lot of cultural capital, where people respect the profession immensely, practitioners of that profession perceive themselves to be participants in generating the profession's knowledge. If you're a doctor, you conceive of yourself not only as curing patients, but contributing to knowledge about medicine within the profession. And I don't think teachers get to do that very much. I really tried to write my book from learning from teachers and studying teachers. And I think some people resist that and aren't comfortable with that idea and think that it has to be derived from some other source, which I think is sort of strangely dismissive of teachers. I love the idea of studying teachers and learning from them. I think that there's some resistance in my book because it comes from the charter sector, and the charter sector is controversial here. People perceive me to have come from the charter sector, even though to me, I study teachers, great teachers, period. Mm-hmm. I think I'm still perceived as a charter thing, and charters are outside the status quo and not popular in this country. And I think that there is a certain discomfort among some people with the reality that in order to do right by students in the classroom, you have to be able to establish an orderly classroom. I think, Teach Like a Champion 2.0 is 12 chapters, of which 10 are about the craft of teaching and getting kids engaged in lessons and how to design the lessons. And the last 2 chapters are about behavior. But if you ask someone in this country what my book is about, they will say, "Oh, that's the book about making kids behave." It's the last 2 chapters. I put them at the end in particular. I think people associate me with that because there's kind of a market failure, an unspoken market failure that teachers deal with every day about how do I get kids to do what I ask them to do in the classroom. That for the most part, it's awkward to talk about. Schools of education don't want to really acknowledge that it's there. If I'm preparing kids for placement in the easiest schools, it's not as big an issue. If I really want people to be successful in the most challenging parts of society, it is important, but people are very uncomfortable with that notion. And I think that, so between the charter thing and people confuse, in our country, there's so much discussion right now about social justice, and people confuse the abuse of power by police in certain places in our society, the abuse of authority by police, with the benign and appropriate use of authority by a teacher, which is necessary to help people become self-actualized students in society. People confuse those two things, and so when you show an orderly classroom, people say, "Oh, you're trying to police black and brown bodies," and I just think that that's fundamentally wrong. But a certain number of people are uncomfortable with orderliness in the classroom, and I think that they associate me with that, and so they don't like to use my book for some reason.
Well, I talked to Diane Ravitch a couple of months ago, and of course, she's really not really a proponent. She's an opponent of charter schools, and her main concern is that charter schools select only the best pupils. Maybe every student is allowed, but over the years, there's a high dropout rate.
I think the data would erode that argument very quickly. If she was empirical about asking that question neutrally, it would be very hard to sustain.
Let's move to the 21st century. One of the hypes of the century is 21st century skills.
Yeah.
We should focus more on collaboration, critical thinking, the whole thing. What's your opinion?
I think schools have, I think for the most part, it's a bit of a distraction. You hear all the time this argument that the jobs of the 21st, 80% of the jobs of the 21st century have not been invented yet.
Exactly.
We prepare people for those jobs. We have to, you prepare. First of all, it's a made up statistic. Second of all, 80% of the jobs now had never been imagined 30 years ago. And 80% of the jobs 100 years ago had never been imagined.
Exactly, that's my point.
So nothing has changed. Yeah. And the way that you prepare people for uncertainty is to build a strong foundation of knowledge. And to me, the 21st century skills, ironically, are the most important 21st century skill to the degree that something like that exists, is the ability to sustain focused attention, the ability to read, and the ability to write. To me, the single biggest hidden issue in education today is the way that constant access to screens is changing the way that we think. People, not just kids, spend more and more of their time reading and thinking in screen-based environments where the average task duration is 2.5 minutes. So students never concentrate on a single task for an hour and a half, read deeply without being interrupted by their cell phones for a book, write in the state of deep meditation, words, music, etc. And I think that there's a lot of research coming out. Marianne Wolf's book, Read or Come Home, is a great example, that not only are we losing the ability to read and write well, but it changes the way that we think, and the ability to sustain deep reflective thinking over long periods is being eroded by our infatuation with technology. So ironically, I would say the best way to prepare for 20th century jobs is science, history, English, math, music, art, deep knowledge of content, being able to read, being able to write, and being able to sustain thinking, which to me is ironically in a low-tech environment with a lot of reading and a lot of writing. Collaboration collaboration, great. We should kids should occasionally have the opportunity to work together. They will, for the most part, learn those things in the workplace. I think what they need from school is the background of knowledge and skills that they can take into those environments and be successful.
I
just don't think that the mission of school to being about knowledge and skills has changed very much.
I think the only new thing about 21st century skills, as opposed to ancient Greek skills, is the digital part. Of course, you had to collaborate in ancient Greece, and of course, you had to collaborate in the Iron Age and to think creatively. It's
right.
That
hasn't changed.
Nothing has changed. If you start, I'm really curious about when you first started writing the very first page. and where you are now. Could you give me a short overview of the history of this book? When did you first start writing? Why? And where are you now with the organization?
I started writing it. I didn't even realize I was writing a book when I started writing it. I started writing it in maybe around, I don't really exactly know when I started writing it, but I started taking notes on it in maybe 2001 when I would work with, this is the very beginning of the urban charter school movement, when a bunch of schools were coming into the worst neighborhoods in the U.S. and they were trying to make a difference for communities where 2 and 3% of kids would go on to university. And had, well-intentioned, idealistic young people would come into those settings and say, we're going to start schools that are different. And they would come back to us really quickly as the people who ran those schools and say, what do you do if X, Y, they would present to us teaching problems for which there were not solutions. And we just wouldn't know what to say. And I felt like as someone who was running the school, it was wrong not to be able to help well-intentioned people solve problems. And so I started to observe the best, I just finished an MBA and I had some sort of basic data sets on where are the positive outliers. And so I went to observe the teachers who, despite kids of poverty, were really, really achieving incredible success. And very quickly I was struck by the fact that they were similar and different, that they did things that were different from what you would be told you should do if you're in a school of education. And I would see teachers 300 miles apart do something very similar that I'd never seen before. And so I started to just take notes on this because I was at the time working with a bunch of schools that were struggling with the challenge. And it was just kind of a working paper. And I started sharing it with people. And then maybe a year or two later, people would start to email me and say, hey, I have a copy of your, I called it then the taxonomy. I'm not really sure why, the taxonomy of effective teaching practices. And people would email me and they'd say, I have a copy of your document. I have another technique to suggest, or I have a question for you about it. And these would be people I'd never heard of. And I was like, who are you and why are you emailing me? But it just made me realize that what a problem it was in the profession that people were sent out to do this job that was really incredibly hard, and they did not have answers to the questions, and they weren't prepared to be successful. And good people burned out of the profession very quickly because there were not solutions to the day-to-day problems of, what do I do if I say, please sit down, let's start the lesson, and the kid says, you sit down, right? Or I have a kid who's working really hard in the back of the room, but he's not making progress. Or I have a kid who just wants to pull his sweatshirt up over his head and be alone. How do you deal with those? No one tells you about that. So I kept writing this thing, but I didn't really think I was writing a book, and I would just sort of share it with people. And I think the word got out about it kind of accidentally. And then a few things happened. My boss suggested I write a book about it. And he said, you can have a quarter of your time to write a book.
Great.
I was running a couple of uncommon schools at this point, which is interesting because your boss, the one person who can't tell you have a quarter of your time to do something is your boss, because you'd be like, great, you have a quarter of your time. And I was like, hooray, I have a quarter of my time. The phone didn't stop ringing, the emails didn't stop coming, or nothing in the rest of my work life. But I started writing the book, and then as I was writing it, there was this journalist who had somehow heard about it, and she had been asking me to come to my workshops. And I'm just really skeptical that the story you want to tell about the work that you do never gets told accurately in the media. So I kept on saying, no, you can't come. And finally, I let her come to a workshop so she could observe, but I told her I wouldn't support her in writing about it. And if she wrote anything about it, she had to run it by me, and that I wouldn't agree to be interviewed. And she came, and we spent a lot of time. She wrote this article that ended up being in the New York Times Sunday magazine about the time that the book came out. And so the book just got suddenly sort of, I guess, went viral and got a lot of publicity. But almost as soon as I wrote it, it felt, I think this is a good thing. It became obsolete very, very quickly, because as soon as this is one of the reasons why I'm optimistic about the teaching profession. As soon as you give a teacher an idea, they take it and they use it and they do something better with it than you would imagine right away. So like take an idea from the book Cold Call or No Opt Out or something like that, one of the basic ideas. Like within months of that information being out there, I would start to see teachers adapt and change the techniques in ways that I hadn't thought about. And I'd be like, oh my God, that's so brilliant. B, how could I have not thought of that? C, I want to videotape this teacher and put it in the new version of the book. So, I mean, even within, 6 months or a year of writing the first version of the book, I started to feel this very strong anxiety about it being out of date, which is exciting. It's a great thing, right? It was obsolete very quickly. That's what they say about good technology. That's what, like it was. So then I started writing version 2.0, which was really challenging. It was harder to write in many ways because I knew that more people were going to read it, and I knew the reasons that people objected to it, and I knew also the reasons why people who believed in it used the book but used it poorly. And like I'd been to a lot of classrooms where I would go to a school and the principal would say, "We're using Teach Like a Champion, and it's going great." And I would walk through the classroom and I would be like, "Oh my God, like don't do that. That is not what I had in mind." So I wrote 2.0 to try to address those perceptions and interpretations. I definitely prefer it dramatically to version 1.0, and I've been trying to get my publishers to take 1.0 out of print. And now I've just started writing 3.0, which I think is similar. I didn't really want to write 3.0. I fought it, but as I think about it, there's also so much new that I've learned and so much change. So
you have to. If you write 1.0,
I'm going to write it. Yeah, have to.
I mean, it will be obsolete in a couple of years, right? Out of date.
I think it is. I mean, it is. Especially, one of the great things about doing workshops, which is what is we're constantly in a constant state of upgrading our knowledge about the content in the book, because we do workshops on it and we generate new video and show the video to teachers, and the teachers make comments on it. And we're like, oh, wow, that's true. That's smart. That's interesting, and we adapt. So, the language that we use for the techniques is very different now in the workshops, even though it's based on the book, but it's changed dramatically. So, so I just started working on the 3.0 version, which one of the big changes there, I think, is, as you pointed out, I think I need to be more intentional about drawing a line between what research and science tells us about learning and how that shows up in the practice. So cold call is one of my favorite techniques in the book. One of your questions was about what are the best techniques. Cold call, I think, is a really important technique because it causes students to be attentive and engaged, and it also causes them to do retrieval practice.
All students. That's important.
And so two of the things we know from science are that like attention is really, really important. Just what focus, what people pay attention to is easily overlooked and very important in understanding what they learn, and that long-term memory is critical to knowledge, and that you have to do lots of retrieval practice to drive ideas into long-term memory, that it's easily overlooked and critically important. And so cold call is a great tool for managing attention and providing lots of retrieval practice for everyone in the classroom. So I think when I rewrite version 3.0, I think it will help if I can be more intentional about describing the research link behind how cold call is a representation of scientific ideas. So I think that's one of the big changes that will be in this.
Could you give me an example of a scientific book that really inspired you?
There's so many. I do think that, I think some of the simplest ideas are the most powerful. So I think research, the two simple ideas that I think the importance of background knowledge, Daniel Willingham's book, Why Don't Students Like School?
Yeah.
I think teachers believe in this beautiful dream that they will be able to teach higher order thinking as an abstract, that somehow like we will find a way to be able to teach this higher order thinking that you can apply anywhere. And I understand why they want to believe that is real, because it's a beautiful dream. Imagine if you could teach something like that and people could think critically about anything. Of course people want that. It's a beautiful idea. And it's scientifically impossible. I think like Daniel Willingham's book has this fantastic quotation where he says, you can't think deeply about something you don't have background knowledge installed in long-term memory about. It's impossible. You and I have, I can't speak for you, but I've never had I've never done any successful critical thinking about particle physics
No,
because I don't know anything about particle physics, and I never will. I never will have any critical insights about it until I learn something about it. And so the idea that like this is a transferable skill is teachers continue to pursue it and pursue it and pursue it, but it's not. I think you have to. In the age of Google, schools say things like, "Why would we teach facts when you can look any fact up?" And the answer is, if you want to think deeply about something, you have to understand the facts. I think music. I know your music teacher is a great analogy, right? Your creativity is contingent upon your mastery of a core set of knowledge.
Chords,
and
skills.
No one in music apologizes for an understanding theory, minor third here, or the necessity of driving it, of long-term memory and like being able to play a scale without thinking about it. Because if you're going to improvise, you have to, it has to be wired into your brain. So, I mentioned Why Don't Students Like School as an example of many books about the importance of background knowledge, which I think is critically important, easily overlooked because it's not sexy. I think retrieval practice is another really important concept. I think cognitive load theory is a really important concept that's very easily overlooked. I think you could probably make a list of like 10 core ideas from cognitive science.
So this is very interesting. So you can back up many of your ideas with science, and it would be great to see that in version 3.0.
I haven't done. Yeah, it's. I mean, I think that's really what 3.0 is about. Doing the footnotes of like, here's the scientific rationale behind why this works, and what we know about it. Because I think that's. It's obsolete for that. Like people rightly want to know what the concepts are, and if they know what the concepts are, they'll be better able to understand how to use it and how to expand the idea. So 3.0 version 3.0 will be the science version. I think the other thing that will be in it is people talk a lot about relationships. One of the other quotations that you hear all the time in teaching is they don't care what you say until they know that you care. And so I think that a lot of teachers spend a lot of time trying to build relationships as if it was a prerequisite for teaching. And to me, the way that you build relationships with students is by teaching them effectively. And that in the end, if you're trying to walk around the hallways, high-fiving students and asking them about their weekends, some students may like that and some students don't. But they know in their hearts that your job is to teach them. And if you're not teaching them, you're not going to have the sort of relationship that's important with them. And the teachers who we love are the teachers who we remember because they taught us something, maybe even taught us something we weren't sure we could learn. I'm sure it's especially that way. I suspect it's maybe especially that way for you in music. It's like the teachers you feel the closest connection to were the ones who maybe not necessarily were like the friendliest, but the ones who caused you to have a breakthrough at the thing that you wanted to learn. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of work. A second theme to the new version of the book is going to be to help people conceive of relationship building as a part of learning, not something separate from learning that you have to do before people can learn.
Well, I was glad to hear that you refer to higher order thinking skills as part. They are domain specific.
Yes, exactly.
Last year I interviewed E.D. Hurst Jr. and he wrote a book called Cultural Literacy. And what he sees in society is that more and more schools are focusing on those higher order thinking skills at the expense of knowledge. And that causes inequality. I mean, if you don't have...
His chapter on France in his new book, have you read that?
Why Knowledge Matters? You mean that one?
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. The one that just came out last year, I think it's called Why Knowledge Matters,
maybe a new one. He keeps writing. This guy is amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I cited Willingham, but I really should. I mean, Willingham is more scientific. Mm-hmm. E.D. Hirsch was right without really the science on it, and I think Willingham provides the science to support E.D. Hirsch. E.D. Hirsch is interesting because I think he's exactly right about knowledge. He's also, I find him sometimes hard to read because his writing is very judgmental. So I think but I think you're right that his emphasis on the regressive effect of our belief that critical thinking is not domain specific is devastating.
Yeah. So I would like to end the interview with a practical question. Which
Okay.
which of all of these techniques, well, could you name your top three? I mean, you've
Sure.
visited so many schools, and which are the champion theories in this book?
Okay. I mean, I think I'll tell you my favorites. And my favorites have changed in part because I'm like you, I'm a dad. I have 3 kids. And people told me that having kids would change me, and it has. The thing I think that some of the things I care most about is writing. I think one of the big differences between 2.0 and 1.0 is the importance that 2.0 places on writing. You know, the whole chapter of my favorite chapter is ratio through writing. And so, number one, I think show call is simple, but it's an absolute game changer in that it allows us to make the written lives of students visible and studyable, both holding them accountable for the written work that they do, but also when we talk about how to write better, if I can project writing in front of the class and we can analyze it, then we can make it better. And it's also, I think, this is one of the things I've learned from watching teachers do that I didn't see clearly enough when I wrote 2.0 how powerful show call was as a check for understanding tool. That the best way to, when a student makes a mistake in a classroom, a useful mistake, right? They did something wrong because they were thinking about it. They did something, they had a good idea, but they went about it the wrong way, and so they got the wrong answer. Projecting that work on the board and analyzing our thinking together, and then like that is the core of learning, right? Like studying our own mistakes and learning from them. And show call makes that possible. And so I think it's super powerful as a writing technique, but I think I underestimated the degree to which it's really at the core of a really powerful check understanding cycle too. So that might be my sort of hidden favorite technique. I also really love the technique part of the sentence because I think teaching students to expand the range of tools they have to express ideas on paper allows them to expand the ways that they can think about things. In other words, when you have nuanced and sophisticated syntax to describe ideas, you can have nuanced and sophisticated ideas. In the same way, people talk about this with vocabulary all the time. The Eskimos have 40 different words for snow, so they can conceive of snow in 40 different ways, and we only have one word for it. I think that syntax is very similar to vocabulary, in that when I have words of having a word for something gives me a tool to talk about it, and that creates the idea in my mind. Having more advanced syntax and the ability to describe ideas in more nuanced ways lets me conceive of ideas in more nuanced ways. And so I really, really love the technique part of the sentence, which is about expanding syntactic control. And then it wouldn't be Teach Like a Champion if my third technique weren't super mundane. So I'm going to go with what to do, which is I just think that so often children want to be successful in the classroom, and so often we don't give enough attention to what our directions sound like, and so they're confused about what they should be doing and how to do it, and they don't succeed because the directions aren't good enough. And I think some of them, you asked at the beginning about like simple, powerful ideas that can have a change that is beyond a tiny idea that can have a profound effect. I think being better at explaining to people what you want them to do and giving directions is like we do it all the time, over and over, every day. And if you've ever listened to yourself or listened to a teacher giving directions, like it's a miracle anybody gets it right. We're just not very good at giving directions. Some of the best teachers I know like write out the directions they want to give for the task in advance and refine it so kids understand exactly what they want to do. And I think it's something that we're so familiar with that it's kind of a hidden blind spot for us as educators. So I'm going to throw that one in there as a sleeper for number 3. Actually, I'm going to tell you, I'll give you one more because I also love it. I really, really believe in reading, and that reading is dying. It's fighting a losing battle. You
mean reading books? Because everybody is reading.
When they read at all, they read on screens, but they don't really read when they read on, for the most part, for children today, the book is fighting it's in the last throes of a death battle against Snapchat and Instagram and all other things. So if we want people to read, we have to do two things. We want them to read. We want them to love reading and see the joy in reading, and conceive of reading as a social function, where they enjoy the text with other people. They hear other people making meaning of it, laughing at it, crying at it, and that connects them in some social way. And where they sustain their focus on reading for significant periods of time. Control the game is one of my favorite techniques, because it's just a process for reading together as a group in a way that's engaging and causes students to lose themselves in the text and see their peers losing themselves in the text and concentrate on the text for a long period of time, and to overcome some of the fundamental barriers that keep them from being able to think deeply about text. I think this is a very scientific, an idea with a lot of scientific basis, which is you can't be thinking deeply about a text unless you're absolutely fluid and automatic at your prosody and your fluency and your decoding, and students are not. And so reading aloud makes them better at getting to at being automatic at reading, so that they can think deeply about texts. So control the game is it's beautiful and it's fun, and when kids get together and they're reading a book and they're laughing at it together, it's a great thing, and it always gives you something. No matter what, you can always be reading something in class if you can control the game. And so if you have 10 minutes left over because your lesson was short or something unexpected happened, like, what can I be doing that's valuable right now? I should always be able to read with a group of students in any class. So those might be my top four.
The only remark I would have about Teach Like a Champion is when I see those videos, show calling, co-calling, they're only real nice kids. What I would like to see, how do we get from a total mess in your classroom to the activity of show calling or co-calling? Because that's the biggest challenge, to get the class in order and ready to learn. I see a video where everybody's quiet, where everybody's ready. What I want to see is a teacher who enters a classroom where they're throwing chairs and pencils, and then within 10 minutes we are co-calling.
I mean, thank you for that. It's a great point, and people say that all the time. And sometimes I say, oh, well, no wonder they're doing it, because the kids behaving is an effect, not a cause. In other words, it's why order in the classroom is so important, and why when people mistake the nature of order in the classroom and they see it as a form of policing kids as opposed to giving them freedom, that's the great misinterpretation. So there are a lot of people in this country who will say that, there's something immoral about teachers, especially white teachers, telling black and brown students to sit down and what to do. And I understand why they say that, but it's dead wrong, because the only way that you can give them science and history and art and English and math is if they make a trade and they willingly give up their right to disturb the classroom and disturb their classmates' learning, and what they get back is the history of knowledge. And so these are all classrooms where, starting on day one, they've installed really strong systems and routines, and they've done the behavior and
That's
culture.
it. And people don't see that. We see the technique of co-calling, but we don't see the process leading up to it. Because at the start of the year, the class might have been a mess, and with all different kinds of techniques, the teacher was able to control the crowd, and we don't see that process. So
that's interesting. So you want to see some longitudinal data. In other words, here's the teacher on day one walking into the classroom. It's crazy. Here are the things that here she is on week 2.
It's a long road. It's a long road before you go to this content. So there should be a book before this one. Yeah. I don't mean 1.0, but I mean.
No, you're right. You're really. It's a really good point. Sometimes at our workshops, we show first day video. So we'll show a video of a teacher. Here she is in February. Oh, her classroom's incredible. My classroom doesn't look like that. The kids don't sit down. Here's what she did on the first day. So the second video is here she is on the first day, building her systems. But you're right. People really need to see the process.
Because if I've been teaching teaching for 10 years now. So
Yeah.
I think I know the trades a bit by now. So when I have an intern and she sees me doing the activity, she might think, well, this is fun. Let's do it next time. And it will be a mess because
Not going to look like that for her.
no, that's when you enter the classroom and was like, this is not what I meant with teach like a champion. This is not what I had in mind when you enter some classrooms.
That's interesting. Maybe that means the right answer to your question of like, what are the most important techniques would be, your questions made me rethink my answer. And I think that I would say, chapter 10, the systems and routines chapter, that's where you start. Mm-hmm. If you need to have an orderly classroom, right? It's like, here's how we're going to do it here is you have your systems.
Yeah, and I remember when I first entered my classroom, before I was a professional guitarist, you know, I did concerts, and then suddenly I was in front of the classroom. And the mentor process of realizing that's not the children who are behaving badly, but it's your lack of competencies. These processes are so important, and I know that the good teachers in my environment have these mental models and are able to see themselves as the big mistake in the classroom and as the children. And that's, I think,
it takes a lot of humility not to blame the children.
Yeah.
And to blame, and not blame yourself, but to accept that if you engineer the behavioral environment correctly and you're attentive enough and diligent enough, you can have a classroom that looks like that is joyful and orderly for you and joyful and orderly for children. And it's possible. But the easier thing to do is to either blame children and say, you know, these kids are bad, that these kids won't do it, or to ask, or to make the whole like argument that order is bad for kids and that they shouldn't have it, right? Those are easier moves than the hard work that you did to build your classroom to a place where it looked like it should.
My last question is, who should I interview next? Who inspires you?
Oh, so many people. Do you know, have you read Harry Fletcher Wood's book, Responsive Teaching?
No.
He's great. First of all, like the people I love most are thoughtful people who are especially humble, and he's brilliant and humble. So I would interview him. Have you read this book, The Writing Revolution?
Nope.
Judith Hochman. This book is a huge game changer. So I would put her on your list. And Sean, maybe those two would be the ones that I would start with. They're great books.
Yeah, well, thanks. Let me end by thanking you a lot for your time. I mean, I scheduled you half an hour, but we've been talking for 45 minutes, so
it's been fun, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I'm grateful.
Do you have any video of your classroom?
I have many videos of my classrooms, which I record just for myself to see what I'm doing wrong. I've been doing that for the last 10 years.
It doesn't surprise me as a professional musician that you think about it that way. One of the other flaws I think with the book is that there is not enough wide variety of subject matter, like particularly music and the arts. So one of my projects for this year is music and arts teachers. If you would ever like to share some of your video, I'd love to study it, and I'd be happy to send you some feedback if that's useful. But
great.
If you have anything that you would like to share, I'd be happy to watch it and be grateful to have it.
Yeah, I will. I record many lessons just for myself to reflect, because I don't think my team leader is really has the skills to assess my qualities. It's my students. I always ask my parents, my students, and my peers, how am I doing? It's not that my team leader who visits my class for 10 minutes. That's
a sad statement, but I think that's true of a lot of teachers, right?
So we have to collect our own evidence. So I'll keep that in mind. If I have a nice lesson and maybe one of these skills in it, I'll share it with you. So
sounds great. I appreciate that.
Thanks for your time, and see you next time.
See you soon. Thanks I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye.